It started with a feeling, something watching me. Then, I saw it, just for a moment. Tall, faceless, wrong. It had no eyes, but I knew it was staring. The more I noticed it, the closer it got. It wasn't outside the ship. It was inside me. I tried to run, tried to escape. But how do you run from something that sees without eyes? You were never alone. Space was silent. Commander Elias Kane had spent 6 months aboard the Oblivion 9, a deep space research vessel assigned to survey the lifeless exoplanet N38. It was a simple mission: scan the atmosphere, analyze surface conditions, and transmit data back to Earth. Alone. He had trained for isolation, prepared for the long months without human contact. But lately, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. Just a sensation, a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. Like he was being watched. Elias ignored it. Space had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The vast emptiness, the endless void, it made even the strongest minds crack. But then, the sensors started picking up something strange. The ship's motion detectors logged faint disturbances, small shifts in air pressure, the kind that only happened when something moved. But every time Elias checked the security feeds, nothing. Just empty hallways, dimly lit corridors, and the soft hum of the ship's life support system. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger, until one night he saw it. The first glimpse. Elias sat at the command console, sipping stale coffee, eyes locked on the data streaming in from N38. The readings were normal: thin atmosphere, high radiation, nothing unusual. Then, the external camera feed glitched. A flicker, a distortion. He frowned, tapping the screen. A shadow moved. A tall, humanoid figure, just for a fraction of a second, standing near the ship's docking bay. Elias's breath hitched. His fingers moved instinctively, switching to a different camera angle. Nothing. The docking bay was empty. He replayed the footage, frame by frame. There, the shadow again. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something. A figure. Tall, gaunt, unmoving. And the worst part, it had no eyes. Yet somehow, he felt it looking at him. A shiver crawled down his spine. His rational mind fought for control. Maybe it was a camera error. A data corruption in the feed. He ran a system diagnostic. No malfunctions. No anomalies. Elias sat back, rubbing his temples. It was nothing. Just stress. Isolation fatigue. That's what he told himself. Until the whisper started. The whisper in the dark. Elias woke to a sound. Faint. Just at the edge of perception. A whisper. Not words. Not exactly. More like a breath, something shifting in the silence. His pulse quickened. He sat up, eyes scanning the dimly lit quarters. The ship was deathly still. Only the soft blinking of control panels breaking the darkness. Then, a rustling sound, like fabric dragging across metal. His breath caught. He was alone on this ship. There was nothing that could make that noise. Slowly, he reached for the emergency light next to his bed. His fingers hovered over the switch. He hesitated. The whispering grew louder. Not from the walls. Not from the comms. From inside his own mind. "You see me now." Elias flipped the light on. The whispering stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the room. Nothing. No movement. No figure in the dark. Just his own ragged breathing. His eyes darted to the door, to the corridor beyond. Shadows stretched across the floor, still and undisturbed. But something felt different. The air felt heavier, like he wasn't alone anymore. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. He needed answers. He needed to check the cameras again. And this time, he wouldn't look away. Elias sat at the command console, sweat beading at his temples. His hands hovered over the controls, fingers trembling slightly. He didn't want to check the cameras again, but he had to. The external feed flickered to life. The docking bay appeared, dimly lit, empty as ever. He cycled through different angles, hallways, airlocks, engine rooms, each one revealing nothing but the cold, sterile interior of Oblivion 9. Then, a glitch. Not a normal camera distortion. Not a brief flicker of interference. A shadow, tall, thin, human-like. Standing at the far end of the corridor outside the control room, Elias's blood ran cold. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera. The image was blurry, but he could see just enough. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Yet the moment he locked onto it, a sharp pressure squeezed at his chest, as if something was pushing into his mind. Watching, he tried to zoom in. The feed cut to static. A low whisper crawled through the ship's speakers. "You are looking now." Elias shoved himself away from the console, heart hammering against his ribs. He had to move. He grabbed the emergency flashlight, barely registering the weight in his shaking hands. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run. But where? The thing was inside the ship. The walk through the dark. The corridors felt longer than before. Every step echoed, stretching through the silent vessel. The red emergency lights pulsed faintly along the walls, casting shifting shadows that made his stomach tighten. He passed the storage bay, the airlock, the crew quarters, empty, lifeless. His own breath sounded too loud, too unnatural. Then he reached the observation deck. The glass stretched out before him, revealing the endless void of space. The dead exoplanet N-38 loomed below, a wasteland of ice and jagged terrain. But something moved in the reflection. Elias's stomach twisted. The shape was there, standing just behind him. He spun around. Nothing. His breath came in shallow gasps. He turned back to the glass, pulse roaring in his ears. The shape was closer now, standing right behind his shoulder. A whisper slithered through the air, though no sound should have been possible in the vacuum of space. "You see me now." The ship lurched violently. The lights died, and in the pitch black, Elias heard footsteps. The ship was silent. Elias stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his grip tightening around the emergency flashlight. The darkness was absolute, so thick it felt almost solid, pressing against his skin like a living thing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from somewhere deep in the corridor behind him. No, not footsteps. Something dragging. A faint, wet sound, like flesh sliding across metal. Elias's fingers trembled as he flicked on the flashlight. A weak beam cut through the void, illuminating the hallway ahead. Empty. The sound stopped. He turned, sweeping the light behind him. Still nothing. But the air had changed, thicker, colder. The kind of cold that wasn't just temperature. The kind of cold that seeped into the bones, into the mind. Then, a whisper. "You are listening now." The flashlight flickered violently, and for a fraction of a second, the beam illuminated something in the dark. A shape. Tall. Thin. Wrong. Not standing. Not moving like a living thing should, but shifting. Flickering. Like it was between two places at once. No eyes. No face. No form that made sense. But Elias felt its gaze. His chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The thing just stood there, its featureless form barely visible at the edge of the failing light. Waiting. Watching. Then, it took a step forward. Elias bolted. He didn't think. He just ran, feet slamming against the metal floor, heart hammering against his ribs. His breath came in short. Panicked gasps as he tore through the corridors, flashlight swinging wildly. The ship groaned around him, the air thick with a pressure that made his skull feel like it was caving in. He reached the command center, lunged for the control panel, and slammed the emergency lockdown. Doors sealed. Systems engaged. He pressed his forehead against the console, chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Then, a handprint bloomed across the screen. Not a normal handprint. Not human. Too long, too thin. Fingers stretching out like roots burrowing into the glass. It had touched the ship. It wasn't just following him anymore. It was inside. Elias staggered backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The handprint on the screen began to spread, the glass beneath it distorting, warping outward as if something was pressing through from the other side. Then, the whisper returned. "You let me in." A sharp static burst filled the command center, warping the ship's monitors. The screen flickered violently, distorting into fractured images, shadows twisting in the hallways, his own reflection staring back at him, but wrong. His own eyes missing. Elias clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. "This isn't real," he muttered. "It's in my head." The whisper laughed. Not from the speakers. From inside the room, Elias swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The ship's AI, Archo 3, crackled to life. The voice was warped, hollow, as if something else was speaking through it. "Commander Kane," it said, the tone disturbingly calm. "There is an unknown presence in the vessel. Biological readings have been compromised." Elias swallowed hard. Compromised how? The system paused. Then, in a voice identical to his own, it answered, "You are not alone." The emergency lights flickered. A tall, thin figure stood in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but Elias felt it watching him, even without eyes. His body refused to move, his mind trapped in an overwhelming pressure, a force pushing into his thoughts, into his memories. And then, it spoke, not aloud, but inside his mind. "Do you understand now?" The room twisted. The screens blinked, images flashing too fast to process. Moments that hadn't happened yet. His own body floating in the void. His own voice whispering from the ship's speakers. His own handprint pressed against the glass. The cycle was repeating. It had happened before. It would happen again. Elias's breath hitched. He finally understood. He was never alone. He had never been alone. The whisper had always been here. And now, it was waiting for him to see it. Elias forced himself to move. His body felt heavy, like he was wading through something unseen, something pressing down on him from all sides. The figure in the doorway remained motionless. Tall, gaunt, wrong. No eyes, no mouth. But somehow, he felt its gaze digging into him, slipping through his skin like it was inside him already. The ship's monitors flickered again. Camera feeds flashed across the screen. Hallways, storage bays, airlocks, each one empty. Then, the command center. The screen showed Elias standing alone. But that wasn't true. He turned to look behind him. The figure was still there. But on the screen, it wasn't. His breath hitched. It was never in the cameras. Because it wasn't outside of him. It was inside. The whisper slithered through his mind. "You are looking now." The lights cut out. Total darkness. A cold breath brushed against his ear. Then, a hand gripped his shoulder. Fingers too long, too thin, too wrong. Elias screamed. The mind fractured. When the lights flickered back on, he was standing in a different room. No memory of moving. No recollection of how he got there. The observation deck. The endless void stretched beyond the glass. The dead exoplanet loomed below. His reflection stared back at him. But something was off. He stepped forward, heart pounding. His reflection didn't. It stood still, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, its head tilted. Elias didn't move, but his reflection smiled. The whisper was everywhere now. "You are me." The glass shattered, and the void swallowed him whole. Elias didn't remember falling. One moment, he was standing before the shattered glass, his reflection staring back with that impossible smile. The next, cold, weightlessness. Darkness pressing against his body, squeezing into his lungs. He was drifting. The dead exoplanet loomed below, its frozen wasteland stretching endlessly. Above him, the shattered remains of oblivion. 9 flickered with dying lights, its broken hull spinning slowly. But the worst part wasn't the cold. It was the silence. Not the silence of space. Not the absence of sound. It was a presence. A silence that watched him, filled him, became him. Then, a voice inside his skull. "You have finally let go." Elias gasped, but there was no air to breathe. His limbs flailed, reaching for something, anything. But the void offered nothing back. Then, movement. Not his own. Something was in the dark with him. A shape, unfolding, expanding. The same tall, thin figure that had haunted him on the ship. But now, it was everywhere. Its form stretched across the stars. Its limbs twisting through the black like threads of living shadow. It had no eyes, but he could feel it staring. "You understand now." The final revelation. Elias's thoughts began to split apart, unraveling like old fabric. Memories, his childhood, his training, his arrival on Oblivion. 9, all of it felt distant, detached, like they didn't belong to him anymore. "You were never alone." Elias's pulse slowed. The entity wasn't hunting him. It had always been inside him, watching, waiting, becoming. The whisper returned, but this time, it wasn't a voice separate from his own. It was his voice, You were me before you ever knew. His body stopped struggling. The void welcomed him, and Elias Kane ceased to be. The final transmission. Weeks later, a salvage vessel intercepted a distress signal from the Oblivion 9. They found the ship derelict, drifting silently through deep space. No signs of life. No remains of Elias Kane. Only one thing remained. His final video log, still playing on the cracked command console. Elias's hollow-eyed face stared into the camera, his expression eerily calm. "If you're watching this," he whispered, "it's too late for you." His voice sounded wrong, layered, echoing, like it was being spoken by many voices at once. His head tilted slightly, and then he smiled.